Greetings, dear friends, fellow programmers, and those aspiring to be. I have a question for you. Did you ever feel like your ASP.NET Core code is not performing as well as you would like it to? Well, if that is the case, and you did encounter those situations, I would like to share a piece of information that just might be exactly what you need to fix those issues and forever get rid of them. Today, we will be covering two very significant techniques for optimizing your database performance while working with Entity Framework. So, the techniques I'm mentioning here are eager loading and lazy loading. So, I do not want to waste your time any further. Let us jump right into the discussion about these two concepts. First of all, I would like to welcome you to our Visual Studio environment, where I want to show you something that we will include in our DB context configuration, which is going to allow us to have insights into the Entity Framework generating SQL for us, and how we are going to be able to see the queries that are being created by Entity Framework. So, what we need to do is introduce this line right here. This method right here is what you definitely need in order to be able to work with a database in your projects. But this part right here is something that we are going to include in order to enable our Entity Framework to log all the queries that are being generated by it, and that will allow us to be able to see exactly what is going to be executed against the database. Great! Now that we got it out of the way, it's time for us to get started with eager loading. That's the first concept we will be covering today. What this concept stands for is maybe easier to be explained with a reference to something in our real lives. For example, when you go to a restaurant and order a dinner and you receive all the dishes at once, that is something like eager loading, because with eager loading, you will be getting all the main objects that you asked for in the query, as well as the objects and entities that are connected to it that you requested as well. So basically, it is the same thing as you getting the appetizers, soups, main dishes, salads, and desserts at the same time in the restaurant. And now that we got it out of the way, we know what eager loading is in theory, it's time to cover it in practice as well, right? The fact that you will be executing just a single SQL query against the database to fetch all of the necessary information you need means that you will not be too chatty with your database, and you will not make multiple requests to it, and that way put on a lot of load on the database. And that is really desirable behavior while designing your database communication, because you will not be so chatty with it as much as you would if you did not optimize for eager loading. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So, what we have here is the eager loading example. We have a context which contains all of our entities in the database, and we want to fetch orders, all orders we have in the database, and also we have this include statement which exists in Entity Framework library. Then what we will do is provide an expression to Entity Framework in this include statement, which is going to guide Entity Framework to fetch customer for the order. So let me show you. This right here is our order entity, and it has a customer property attached to it, which is an object. And then you have the actual customer properties. So what we did here, we said to Entity Framework, I want you to include customer that is attached to the order we are talking about here. And then when we got it, then we will make everything to list async and actually materialize it and execute the query against the database. So what will happen when I run this code? Let's see. Great stuff. As we can see right here, this is the query we're executing against the database. And the great part is the fact that we only have a single query. We have a single select statement that gets executed to fetch order ID, customer name from orders table with alias of letter O, and also to join it with customers database table on customer ID. So basically where the customer ID is equal to customer ID on the customer database table, those two entities will be joined together and we will receive order which is going to contain data about the customer. So let me show you that as well. Let me execute this line. And now when I check orders and when I open any order, we will see that customer property is not null. It is populated with customer data. And now if I were to replace and remove the include statement from the chain of LINQ commands, we will get a different result. Let me show you. So when we execute this, we will take a look at each of the orders, but customer is null. That is because we did not join it with the customer database table. And when we take a look at the query itself, you do not see any inner joins. We just fetch the data from the orders database table. That is an awesome feature provided to us by Entity Framework, which allows us to put multiple join statements into our main select statement to fetch all the necessary data that we want to fetch for our request. Now, while we're on the subject of talking great stuff about eager loading, let's discuss some of the benefits that will be introduced while utilizing this method. The first and main point of this approach is going to be performance, because we will be executing just a single query against the database, and chatting with the database too much reduces the performance and the capabilities for scalability of your database and project in general. Point number 2 is going to be consistency. And this one is also important because while using include method, you know for sure that the data you specified in the include statement will indeed be returned to you and you will have access to the named property. And point number 3 is a very significant one as well, and it is simplicity. It is very important that you can do something in a simple fashion without the need to do a whole bunch of stuff to make something happen. We just need to use the include method and specify with expression which property we want to be fetched from the database. And everything else will be done for us. But as everything else in life, eager loading is not perfect. It has its own limitations and drawbacks. The first one being the fact that you can overfetch the data. So while specifying which properties you want to be joined with the main entity you are fetching from the database, you may include stuff you actually do not need, or some properties of those pieces of data are not going to be used and you overfetch data, which costs memory and CPU time. So you do not want to do that. And the second drawback is complex queries. When the list of your includes gets on and you chain a lot of included properties, you will end up with a very complex query that can be a problematic thing to execute against the database. And you definitely want to make sure that your queries are as performant and also do not fetch anything you do not need, so you would not end up in one of these problematic scenarios. As I promised in the beginning of this video, at least now you will be able to make an informed decision when you want to use and utilize eager loading and when you just do not want to do it because the drawbacks are going to outweigh the benefits of including this approach. So, now that we are done with it and we know what eager loading is, it is time to put another concept to our belt. And I'm talking about lazy loading, which is basically the opposite of eager loading. Now, let me try to explain lazy loading with the same reference to you going to a restaurant. So, imagine you sitting down and then ordering your first meal, and then when you're done with the first meal, you order the second one. When you're done with the second one, you order the third one. It's basically the same concept as lazy loading. So the concept itself stands for stuff that is not used will not be fetched from the database. And it will be fetched from the database only at the moment you have tried to manipulate it or access it in any way. Until that point, nothing will be fetched from the database. So, of course, this is going to save resources because you will not be fetching stuff you do not use in your code. Now, let me start sharing my screen and show you what we need to do before we start tackling lazy loading. In order to be able to utilize lazy loading that is automatic, you need to include this library right here. It is called Entity Framework Core Proxies. You can include this library in any way you prefer. And after you have done that, you are ready to actually use lazy loading. Now, before we begin, I need to do something else here. In order for lazy loading library that we just included to work, we need to add this line right here. Use lazy loading proxies. And when we have included it, everything should fit in its place perfectly. Now, to prove this to you, let me put a breakpoint right here, and then we can start the application and see what happens. Now, as you can see, still no scripts were executed against the database. When I press F10 and we execute the script for fetching customers and we have them at our disposal, when we go to our terminal, we'll see that a select statement was executed. We fetched all customers from the customers database with their IDs and names. Now that we have done that, we should have them right here. So here they are, we have the data at our disposal. Next thing in line is the for each loop. We will now iterate through each of our customers, and for every one of them we'll fetch orders. Let us go in and do it for our first customer. After I have went through this line right here, we can see that another select statement was executed, this time from the orders database, and it was done with the condition that customer ID on order is equal to the customer's ID of the customer we are currently executing in our for each loop. So this line right here is basically going to be executed against the database, so we would get the information for the orders that are created for this particular customer. I want you to think about something. Do you see an issue arising from the way things are executed right now? What do you think is going to happen now that I just went through another customer? Well, if you said that another query is going to be executed against the database and orders for that customer are going to be fetched, you were 100% right, because that is exactly what just happened. We just executed another query against the database for this customer. So, as many customers as we have, that is how many queries will be executed to fetch orders. And this can be a serious issue, because when we complete the execution, we will end up with a lot of queries being executed, and we just chatted too much with our database. Just imagine the scenario where you had millions of customers and each of those customers has a lot of orders. So this would be a very painful and difficult process to execute, and your server will be under a lot of pressure. So you do not want to execute this without being very careful. What is an issue that arises from using lazy loading is people referencing some pieces, some entities in their code which they do not need maybe, or they reference them and then queries are getting executed all the time, and you basically bombard the SQL database all the time with requests, and the performance of your application is not going to be so great. And people may struggle to actually figure out what is going on, what is causing this issue, and actually your code is requesting stuff all the time from the database. So this can be an amazing feature, but also it can cause serious issues. So that is why I want you to be very much aware of all the benefits and drawbacks of using all of these concepts. And basically, now that we have covered the eager and lazy loading techniques, I think is a great moment to end this video. If you found this video useful and fun and enjoyable, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel because it means a lot. And also, I would like to thank you for watching and, as usual, wish you happy coding!